Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Feed production contributes about 70% of nitrogen emissions in pig production systems. Joining us today to share their ideas on how the industry might improve nitrogen utilization efficiency of pork production are Dr. Jerry Shurson, Professor, Animal Science at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Brian Kerr, Animal Scientist with USDA-ARS-NLAE, and Dr. Edward Yang, Business Development Manager with Nutribins. Thank you so much for joining us all today.
Thanks, Sarah. It's good to be here.
For those of you that are joining us from social media, be sure to type your questions right there in the social media feed, and we will get those to our guests here today. If you're joining us on Feedstuffs 365, you can post your questions right there in the chat, and we will get to those throughout the event as well. So, Jerry, we hear a lot about carbon footprint and emissions when it comes to environmental sustainability discussions. That we really don't hear much about is nitrogen. So, Jerry, give us an overview of why we should be concerned about nitrogen and the need to improve nitrogen efficiency in animal production.
Well, maybe the best place to start, or one place to start, would be just to simply recognize that protein and amino acids that we supply in pig diets are the second most expensive component of swine diets, plus it's the major source of nitrogen that we're introducing into the pork production system. So anything that we can do to improve the efficiency of using dietary protein as we produce pork or convert it into edible lean pork for consumption goes a long way to not only reduce the cost of production, but it also helps us reduce nitrogen emissions in manure and the nitrogen footprint of pork production. And so you're right. I mean, much of what we hear about and read about every day is focused on carbon emissions. And I don't want to take anything away from that because it's high priority. It's extremely important. But I think one of the missing pieces that doesn't get enough attention is the whole story about nitrogen. And the reason that I think nitrogen needs a lot more attention, and I think many scientists that work in environmental sustainability and agriculture would agree that if we compare the three major greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, methane has about 28 times more potency as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But if you throw nitrogen oxide or nitrous oxide into the mix, it's got about 265 times more potency than carbon dioxide. So nitrous oxide is one of the major concerns, I think, that we have in agriculture, and partly because it's not used very efficiently. And it's also, nitrous oxide is also one of the main greenhouse gases emitted by pigs, unlike methane for ruminants. So the other part of this story is that some of you may be familiar with the term planetary boundaries. A lot of environmental scientists use this as a description of the Earth's carrying capacity for certain environmental components. In this case, we're talking about nitrogen. We could talk about biodiversity or even phosphorus for that matter. But when we think about planetary boundaries, it's really the ability or the level of the Earth's ability to regenerate due to various human interventions that are causing disruptions in the environment. To the point of, if we exceed that planetary boundary, it's generally considered that we're entering a territory that's irreversible from the sustainability of the planet's perspective. And so nitrogen and also phosphorus are the two major components that we've already exceeded planetary boundaries on. And so I think that says a lot about the need to focus on ways of improving our efficiency of using nitrogen, not only in agriculture and pork production, but in society in general. And here's, I think, kind of a useful diagram that at least helps me put things into perspective. And this is from a global perspective, we only use about 20% of total nitrogen inputs uh, that are captured in useful products. And notice here, we're talking about combustion engines from fossil fuels, fertilizer manufacturing, crop and biological nitrogen fixation, which is actually a good thing. The blue arrows here represent sort of the intended flows of nitrogen from inputs all the way to outputs and residuals left over. And notice that all the gray arrows and the black arrows are actually the unintended flows, the emissions and the different forms of nitrogen that are lost from some of these natural and agricultural food production types of practices. So only 20% of the nitrogen is captured in useful products of the total that's put into manufacturing them. And that's a big reason why we've exceeded our planetary boundaries for nitrogen at this point. If we bring this a little bit closer to home and talk about nitrogen utilization efficiency in pork production or pork supply chains, this slide's probably a little bit difficult to see. I like it because it shows the complexity of the entire pork chain, but the first green circle here is really feed production. Nitrogen use efficiency is less than 60%. It gets a little bit better when we get to the pig farm in terms of nitrogen utilization efficiency, and pork processing is even more efficient. But when we think about all of the inputs related to nitrogen that go into pork production along the entire chain to get us to the edible lean pork at the consumer level, we're only at about 40% efficiency. And that's another contributing factor to this exceeding of planetary boundaries that we're faced with today. And so what that has led to is that some of you have seen the Sustainable Development Goal color wheel or chart of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. And a couple of years ago, because of the significance of this problem, the United Nations challenged the rest of the world to say, we need to cut nitrogen waste collectively in all segments of human society, including food production, by 50% by the year 2030. And in doing so, some of the estimates are that this would save about $100 billion globally on an annual basis. And it would go a long way to helping us address or achieve some of these 17 different sustainable development goals, all of which are linked in some way to nitrogen utilization. And so many of you may be asking the question at this point, so what does this have to do with me? Or why should I care about this? And I would say it has a lot to do with any of us that are involved in the pork production industry. I remember reading, I think it was a week or two ago, an article in National Hog Farmer that was showcasing a couple progressive producers, the Sprunk brothers here in Southwest Minnesota and Iowa Select Farm. And the article was about using various kinds of sustainability data on their swine farms to show progress toward meeting these sustainable development goals, which is exactly what everybody in the industry needs to be doing if you're a pork producer. And I think that's incredibly important, and we have to do a better job of not only benchmarking where we're at, but developing practical roadmaps to make improvements in some of these areas, and using expanded measures of environmental impacts in the work that we're doing. And that's part of, I think, what brought Brian and Edward and I here today, is to share some of the new ideas and really encourage people to take this to the next level. And it's going to be incredibly important related to a lot of the real pork consortium work that our team here at Minnesota is involved with. I think last week, Sarah, you had Nick Gabler and Alex Lamb on to talk about this new National Pork Board 5-year program that's just been funded. We're excited to be part of it. And it's really about communicating the sustainability and many other aspects of pork production to society and to consumers. So having more measures, having more details really help us collectively tell a more compelling story. And Edward's going to share, I think, some examples of some of the work that we just completed here a little bit later on today that I think fits into this story as well. But before we get to that, I'm going to turn it over here shortly to Brian, and he's going to share some of the highlights of a recent review paper that we just wrote and published that we think kind of help characterize where we've been and where we need to go in the pork industry relative to challenges and opportunities to improve nitrogen utilization efficiency to have a more sustainable pork production story to tell. And so, Sarah?
Very good. Thank you so much, Jerry. So Brian, when it comes to improving nitrogen use efficiency, which Jerry has set the stage well for us here today, what are some of the things that nutritionists think about when formulating swine diets? I know you've been involved in many facets of animal nutrition. Can you provide some insight on kind of how you would first attack this challenge?
Well, thanks, Sarah, for the question there. And like Jerry, I too have been working on this challenge for years to improve utilization. And simplistically, I'm going to put it as an input-output relationship. Inputs being feedstuffs, outputs being pork for the consuming public. So if we don't know targets of where we might have limitations, we're going to have a hard time reducing excretion on the back end. So one of the first targets to look at is really what's going into the animal. In terms of the feedstuffs, we need to know their composition, their availability and composition. And we've always heard that, it's just plain old corn. Well, corn is not corn. Soybeans are not just soybeans. There's a lot of variable factors in there relative to varieties, growing conditions. For example, during heat stress of the crops, that can change composition. How those crops are fertilized and what soils they're grown on, all have influences on their composition. And it's the composition of such relative to their fiber, their starch, fat, minerals, etc., amino acids, that relate to animal productivity, that relate to lean tissue deposition, that we ultimately need to know. So, and it's not just corn and soy. It can be canola meal, wheat byproducts. And also the thing to remember is that, let's say we alter the corn composition, it's not just that product alone, it's downstream products of the corn. So if it goes through a wet or dry milling process, those byproducts, co-products, have their composition altered as well. So to understand composition, we can look backwards. Looking backwards is where we would look at compositional tables. Compositional tables have been done for years. It's been done by amino acid companies. I used to work for an amino acid company. That by knowing the composition, maybe you can predict what it might be. You also have commodity groups, for example, Corn Growers, Pioneer, Checkoff Reports University doing that. We also included that in the swine NRC, and I know the National Animal Nutrition Program is developing tables for that. Again, those are backtracking. We have to know what's in an ingredient with some sort of confidence so that we can understand what's going into the animal. Because if we don't understand that, we tend to have overcompensation or excess levels being fed. So one of the ways of doing that, of course, as most people know, is using NIR to get a real-time analysis of that. And depending upon what programs you have, you then use prediction equations to track over to components such as fiber, starch, fat, and minerals. So an overall composition, which then leads us into understanding what the animal is actually getting. And that is discussed relative to nutrient digestibility. So once again, location can affect the overall composition, but it can also affect the digestibility components. Again, in the animal, we're looking for what goes in the animal, and we're looking at energy, amino acids, etc. And if it can't be utilized in the animal, it's going to come either out in the feces or urine, and we want to minimize that. So that's extremely important. And think of some of the components in a feedstuff. You think of Milo. Is it a high or low tannin Milo? How much phytic acid for a mineral or for phosphorus digestibility it might have? I know there's some urge to feed whole soybeans again. How much urease is in there that might impact digestibility? Even if the crop is harvested, how is it stored? How is it processed? Has it been heated very rapidly and gotten heat damaged kernels relative to corn? Has it been allowed to mold in the field or mold in the bin? Those have factors which affect the digestibility and availability to the animal. We can process corn and co-products to improve their digestibility. Again, we're trying to get what's fed in the animal ultimately into the body, past the intestine. A component of feeding animals that we've worked on quite extensively for probably over 40 years is enzymes. Let's go to an enzyme that has worked extremely well. For example, phytase to release phosphorus in the ingredients. Extremely effective in reducing the amount of phosphorus fed and phosphorus retained in the animal and minimize excretion. When we think of some of our ingredients relative to carbohydrates, that is to break down fiber. We're still developing that. But again, fiber components can interact with nitrogen components, and all those affect what's retained in the body. Lastly, what we need to know is how the age of the animal affects digestibility and utilization, which we'll get to, the fiber type. And I put down here mineral content relative to thinking of maybe some animal byproduct proteins. Because again, composition and their digestibility relative to where you're getting the product all plays into this sustainable utilizing nitrogen better.
So Brian, given that you were on previous NRC committee for swine nutrition and that looked at amino acid requirement recommendations, and the fact we often see a lot of new reports on amino acid requirement studies being conducted by some university research groups, can you provide your thoughts on how genetic improvements in pigs have changed relative to affecting the amino acid requirements and efficiency of dietary protein when it comes to producing edible lean pork? And also, what additional information is needed to improve nitrogen use efficiency in swine production?
Sure. I would say being on the swine NRC was an enlightening experience of what we thought we knew and what we actually do not know. And it really brings to a point of just like the review Jerry and I worked on, of components we need to focus on to improve ultimately productivity, but improve nutrient utilization in the animal. On the basic end, basically nutrient requirements of the animal is to maintain the body weight. So we call that maintenance needs. And then it's for productive purposes. Lean tissue, if you're thinking of gestating sow, it'd be mammary gland or fetal growth. And if you're thinking of a lactational animal, milk production. Those components, we can look at past experiments. We can model that relative to expected performance of the animal. In my opinion, what's not really changed much over time from what reading the literature is the ability or the efficiency of amino acid use for lean tissue deposition above maintenance. That is, once the amino acid is absorbed, in this case, let's say lysine, the ability of that animal to put that into muscle has a certain efficiency, and that's not really changed, if at all, over time. That's a basic metabolical change that's not occurred. What did change relative to the new NRC, which suggests that it's changed, was really, I think, how we looked at the data. So we said the younger pig is much more efficient than the older pig in utilizing absorbed lysine for lean tissue growth. So it had an efficiency of, say, 68%, versus a finisher pig above maintenance had an efficiency of maybe 57%. So you're looking at about a 20% difference in efficiency from a young pig to an old pig. And that's extremely important relative to if we can understand growth potential or actual growth changes in the animal over time. Another example would be when I was in school, we had pigs with maybe 3.5-inch loini and an inch and a half of back fat. Well, nowadays, that's not the case. So what has changed extensively, in my opinion, relative to genetic progress, genetics has really changed the rates of lean tissue growth. There's been some changes in feed intake, but if you think of genetic improvements, as I read the literature, we now have animals growing faster, depositing lean at a greater rate than animals in the past. We're also producing animals at a heavier carcass weight. Relative to a gestation or a lactation sow, we're getting more pigs per litter. We have greater milk production. So we have greater outputs of those animals. So what the NRC did is we reviewed the literature, and you apply data on efficiency and intakes to come up with prediction. What we are limited greatly on is also very little research on finishing pigs and very little research on gestation lactating sows. It's just difficult to do. And also most of the research is on lysine, the first limiting amino acid in swine, whereas some amino acids, really we have either one or no estimates on their nutrient requirements. So we made great progress, but again, we need to use the old data and build upon it. Don't repeat the old data, but build upon it to help understand modeling mechanisms to a greater degree.
So we do have a question, Brian, from the audience. So I'd like to jump over to that for a minute here. They're asking, has there been any work beyond NIR for development of truck-side tests for rapidly determining nutrient composition of feedstuffs?
I do not know that. I do not know. I think, ask Jerry maybe at the end. Jerry's worked, I think, on some of this in the past. I do not know that at all.
Okay, very good. We'll ask Jerry at the end then. So, Brian, you have summarized numerous studies and given presentations on the effects of feeding reduced protein, amino acid supplemented diets, reducing nitrogen excretions and emissions throughout your career. So is there still one of the best practical solutions for reducing the nitrogen footprint on swine farms? What would you recommend? What's your number one go-to?
Yes, I think it's one of the best. And let's pull up that next slide, I believe. And in that, to get to that point, and I can keep going while we get to the slide there.
All right.
To get to that point, we are feeding groups of pigs. A modeling approach really is looking at a single animal. We need to understand going from an individual animal to groups of animals more. Back up to, I believe.
Yep.
There we go. And I think that's extremely important. Because if you're feeding for the average group, well, basically you're underfeeding half and you might be overfeeding half. So understanding that variability is of critical importance. And that might not be possible today on an individual basis. But if you add the variation gets larger as a pig gets older, and if you add that we have very limited data on finishing pigs, but if you look at feed intake and growth rates, it's the finishing pig which has the largest consumption of feed. And I think we can make a tremendous impact on minimizing or optimizing nitrogen use. The second component I think we really need to understand better is factors that affect lean growth rates and affect feed intake, because they go hand in hand in formulating your diet. So the impact of environmental temperature, feed or water availability, stresses, disease, et cetera, is important. The bottom line, if you go through the literature, and Jerry and I have reviewed the literature, and this literature dates back to 1975. And this is one of those cases where some things haven't changed in 30 or 40 years. That if you meet the nutrient requirements for amino acids for energy, every time you reduce dietary protein by 1 percentage unit, you actually decrease nitrogen excretion, either in the feces or largely in the urine, by 8%. So let's just say you can drop 4 percentage units in protein. That's a tremendous drop in nitrogen. So that's manure nitrogen, that's emissions. Ultimately, that gets to the amount of nitrogen in the manure, which in Jerry's modeling and explanation of life cycle analysis, you then have to think of crops and utilization there.
Very good. Now, to follow up on this, Edward, you just published a study from your PhD thesis on a systems approach to evaluate nitrogen utilization efficiency and environmental impacts on swine growing finishing programs in U.S. pork production systems. Can you explain to us what you mean by a systems approach and the feeding programs that you compared?
Well, so traditionally, swine diets have been formulated on least cost basis, but we need to move beyond focusing only on least cost or best cost when we formulate swine diets and begin to consider a lot of things. Jerry mentioned environmental impacts of types and sources of feed ingredients being used in swine diets. Because like Jerry said and Brian said, our industry is part of the bigger problem and a solution today, right? So the new term that have emerged, especially in Europe, it's the use of multi-objective feed formulation that include environmental footprint matrices for feed formulation. Well, still we need to look at digestible lysine, net energy, etc., but also the impact on, let's say, carbon or climate change, right? So therefore, the systems approach that we are referring to involves using many of the tools that Brian talked about today, like the most current net energy and digestible amino acid data and precision feeding, feed formulation approaches, and combine those to compare the growth performance, carcass compositions, and the environmental impacts of common feeding programs used in the US. And in this study, like we shared on this slide, we compared 4 different growing to finishing feeding programs, 3 of which are commonly being discussed in the US today, like a corn soybean meal diet, a reduced protein diet that was supplemented with synthetic amino acids, and a high distillers diet with 30% distillers grains. And we have an additional diet that we want to see if some synthetic amino acid, like branched chain amino acid, can help alleviate some of the problems that are associated with high distillers inclusion and might improve nitrogen utilization.
So what were your results?
Right. So first, let's look at the feeding programs, right? Like I mentioned, we have 4 different feeding programs. The use of synthetic amino acid and DDGS, we can significantly reduce soybean meal, which are shown in the orange bars here in this bar graph. And comparing that corn soybean meal diet versus the low protein diet or the synthetic amino acid diet, we reduce crude protein by 4% unit. And feeding this corn soybean meal diet with minimum amino acid supplementation resulted actually in the greatest nitrogen intake, nitrogen retention, and urinary nitrogen excretion among all these 4 feeding programs. And the greater urinary nitrogen efficiency, which is shown in the gray bar here, actually can be a concern because it increases the amount of ammonia and the nitrogen emission from the waste. However, when we reduce the crude protein by 4% by using synthetic amino acid in that low protein diet, we actually decreased nitrogen intake and nitrogen retention and urine and nitrogen excretion. And in fact, if we look at the absolute value, which is gram per day, the total nitrogen excretion had a 33% reduction from when we compare that low protein diet versus the corn soybean meal diet, which matches what Brian said exactly, right? For each unit reduction in crude protein, you can reduce nitrogen excretion by about 8%. So this means that while we can reduce nitrogen excretion in the feces and the urine by feeding different diets, but if we look at the growth performance, we're not really optimizing feed conversion and weight gain. If you look at this growth performance data, actually the feed to gain, there's a difference. And the pigs that were fed the low protein diet, it actually performed the worst. So that's why we need to see the whole picture using this systems approach, because productivity also influences sustainability, right? So the story get a little bit different if we look at the DDGS feeding programs too, because the nitrogen excretion from the feces were greater than the other feeding programs, because the maybe coming from the lower digestibility of the amino acid coming from the distillers grains. But when we compare that, the last diet, when we added isoleucine, valine, and tryptophan into the DDGS containing diet, we did solve some of the problems. So that's some of the results.
Now, one of the unique parts of your story is that you used a new digital environment impact calculator, I guess I'd call it, called Optinix. It's from BASF, and it compared several environmental impact measures using the data that you obtained through your feeding trials. Which program gave the best results in your opinion?
Right. That's a really good question, Sarah. And let's get one step back. So Optinix, it's a relatively new tool for nutritionists. For those who are new to the whole life cycle assessment and environmental impact world, basically this is a mathematical model that was built to capture all the inputs and outputs for all stages of the pork supply chain, all the way from growing the crops to manufacturing the feed to raising the pig and eventually harvesting the animal. So a lot of the resources like water, electricity, fuel energy were all accounted to calculate the impact on climate change, water use, and land use, etc. And we used actual data from the animal experiment we conducted and region-specific data to calculate these numbers. So we quantified the environmental impacts of each feeding program using this cradle to farm gate, the LCA model. And actually, each feeding program has some advantage over the others in some way. So, for example, the corn soybean meal diet, that program we evaluated in this study reduced the impact on climate change, which is shown in the first category, marine and freshwater eutrophication, and fossil resource use. And the low protein feeding program actually provided advantages over reducing acidification potentials, terrestrial eutrophication, and water use, while the DDGS feeding programs had the least impact on land use because we're recycling some of the ingredients. So when we combine all these results, we can say, well, feeding a low protein diet can provide advantages of improving nitrogen utilization efficiency and also reducing some environmental impacts like acidification potential, eutrophication, and water use. But the low protein diet did not excel in all measures, right? We think this is a great example why we need to think of a systems approach where we consider everything together. So eventually, it comes down to the essential sustainability goal that we are driving, not only environmental impact, but also productivity and profitability of pork production.
Very good. Thank you, Edward. Let's bring everyone back here because we did have a couple of questions that came in. So, and I know, Jerry, I don't know if you heard the question the first time, but has there been any work done beyond NIR for development of, quote, truck side tests for rapidly determining nutrient composition of feedstuffs? That was a question I don't know if you heard, but we addressed a little bit earlier and we didn't really have any insight to offer. So we wanted to toss it to you and just see if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I can make a couple comments there. there is a lot of interest in using handheld NIR equipment. A lot of it's on the market. I think a lot of feed mills, feed ingredient handlers are using that technology to get dynamic estimates that Brian was talking about. But I think it's important for everybody to realize that in order to have accurate estimates, even with this sophisticated handheld truck side kind of equipment, we have to have a lot of wet chemistry, laboratory analyses that go into developing these calibrations if we're going to get the accuracy that we expect. And sometimes people like to cut corners, maybe not invest as much money in the lab analyses as what's needed. And so in that sort of situation, unless people have gone through a validation process, they may be disappointed with the accuracy. So we have to be aware of what's necessary to make them work, but certainly those kind of tools are available. A lot of industry groups are using them very effectively, but it does take some investment in getting pretty robust data sets from analyzed laboratory data in place so that we have accurate calibrations.
Great point. So Jerry, what should some practical goals for improving measurement and reducing the nitrogen footprint of pork production systems? What should those goals be, in your opinion?
Well, I think, as Edward just finished summarizing, we're at a stage where we need to get beyond simply talking about increases in productivity or improvements in feed efficiency as the primary sustainable development story in pork production. I think we need to start looking at what are the environmental impacts of the feed ingredients that we're using in pig diets, some of the feeding practices that we're using. And so in Europe, in particular, these life cycle assessment databases, such as the GFLI database, which is just an abbreviation for a big international database that's being developed right now for feed ingredients supplied by countries and places all over the world. And it's getting better for US-based ingredients, which was a big deficiency a few years ago. Having that kind of data available to talk about the acidification potential, the eutrophication potential, the climate change impacts, land use, water use, going beyond some of the metrics that are being used today for corn, soybean meal, wheat midds, DDGS, all the other kinds of byproducts and co-products we're using in swine diets, I think is really the next step that we ought to be actively pursuing to have a more robust environmental impact story to tell. And certainly a big part of this has to do with nitrogen utilization efficiency. And so using tools like Optenics, and there are certainly some other services being provided by other industry groups. DSM has a Sustel program, AB Vista has a program, and I know I'm missing others, and I'm not endorsing any of them, other than to say that there's a lot of interesting and helpful things happening in this space that I think we really need to pay attention to, that can really help us as an industry with a more compelling environmental sustainability story. And using some of these precision feeding practices to make sure that we're getting the right feed to the right pigs at the right time, which is just my quick way of summarizing a lot of what Brian mentioned during his comments. Canadians are doing a lot of individual, computerized feeding systems and stations. Some of the Europeans are doing this, trying to minimize this variability that we have in feeding large groups of pigs to make sure that we're getting more customized nutrition at the right stage of growth. And those kinds of things we know how to do. We just need to do more of it and implement some of these practices. I would also add, the last 3 points here very briefly, that I think we need to spend more time evaluating underutilized, high value but low risk from the point of transmission of disease-causing organisms, viruses in particular. We hear a lot about that, particularly with some of our work with virus transmission and concerns about African swine fever virus and others. But there are a lot of underutilized food waste streams out there that I think could really provide some not only economic savings, but also have a dramatic impact on the environmental footprint of pork production. Sarah, I don't know if you remember, probably about a year ago, Riley Pelton and I were on in November, I think, for a Feedstuffs 365, talking about some of the work that we were doing at that time on evaluating the impact of 8% supermarket food waste going into grower finisher pig diets and having a much greater impact on reducing land use change, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions compared to even our low protein synthetic amino acid supplemented diet. So I think we have to start thinking broader than corn and soybean meal based diets and start using these more effectively. And as Brian mentioned, we've got a ways to go on finding more effective carbohydrates and enzyme products because we're going to be dealing with a lot of high fiber ingredients, a lot of byproducts that need to be used for productive purposes and so on. And then lastly, this is kind of a non-nutrition related story, but I guess it is a little bit indirectly related, and that is consider anaerobic digesters on pig farms and ways of producing renewable energy to reduce the energy footprint in pig production outside of the diets and production facilities that we're using. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here. I think we just need to spend more time thinking about those and asking if I were advising pork producers, I would have them ask questions, what could I be doing that I'm not doing now that might make a difference in terms of reducing my environmental footprint?
Great points. And as we wrap up here today, if anyone has any more questions, now is the time to post those. So Edward, I'm just going to sneak back over to you for a sec here. Any final comments, any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, because when I was a former student of Jerry. When I was doing my PhD, Jerry always encouraged us to think beyond just traditional nutrition. And as I'm now working with ingredients and everything, I feel like in Europe there are a lot of discussion. In the US we're behind, but there's a lot of things going on, and we need to keep this this conversation going. Is, for example, Jerry mentioned GFLI, and there isn't really a lot of local data for U.S. specific ingredients, while there are a lot of data from outside of this country. So there are a lot of work we need to do, especially on the sustainability area. Yep.
Jerry, where would you say we are right now in terms of U.S. producers doing the more customized nutrition? Is there a certain kind of percentage where you might say, hey, this is who's doing this and this is where we need to be?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't have a very good answer because I don't have a good sense of what proportion of pork producers in this country are implementing various kinds of practices. I think it's a pretty wide range. I think we have some very progressive producers that are doing a lot of very positive things and taking this whole sustainability story very seriously. And I think there are others that that need to spend some time getting caught up on what's the next step that they can try to do. I would say that I do spend a lot of time working with industry groups around the world, particularly in Asia and Europe, as well as here in the United States. And I would say that even the Asians, many countries in Asia are starting to ask questions and consider, how can I modify my feeding programs? I'll use an example of CP based in Bangkok, Thailand, a major player in pig and broiler production in that region, a major food company and other things. And they're responding to consumers asking questions about environmental sustainability of the chicken they're buying and the pork that they're producing. Certainly the Europeans, I would say, by far are way ahead of where we are in the U.S. And as we think about the global competitiveness of U.S. pork going forward, we're going to have to pick up our game, I think, a little bit in this space to be competing and telling the U.S. pork story in a positive way as we compete with other countries in the export market. We're telling their environmental sustainability story.
Jerry, you mentioned using kind of some, ingredients that we normally don't think about when it comes to hog diets, looking at maybe food waste, looking at some of these things. One of our guests has asked a question about hemp as a feed supplement. Any comments on that?
Well, I might defer this one to Dr. Kerr here in a moment. I'll just make a brief comment that there has been a lot of interest in it. I think the biggest issue with a lot of these things is getting them through the regulatory process. People are asking a lot of questions about safety, and we should be asking questions about feed safety, whether it's the chemical nature of these compounds, whether it's microbiological, whether it's pathogenic bacteria, viruses, you name it. And so with some of our government regulatory processes, I think many people in the industry recognize how slow they are and how difficult it is to get some of these things through. And so I think nutritionally, hemp has a lot of possibilities. But before we can get too serious about it, at least to my knowledge, it's got to get through the regulatory process first. Brian, you got any thoughts?
I think if once it's indicated it's a safe possibility, as nutritionists, we will determine its limitations or its potential in a feeding program nutritionally, and then the industry will figure out how it relates economically into the feeding program. I want to make a quick comment relative to talking about systems model sustainability. What they do is provide us insight on the scientific angle part of what components have a lot of potential for improvement. If it's got a lot of potential for improvement, that gives us scientists targets from which to attack. If we don't have a target, we can't solve a problem. So it provides us targets. It also working on a committee, and when you think about this, and Edward mentioned this, the inputs are critically important. A small change in some inputs can have a dramatic impact on the sustainability index or the model, or whatever you want to call it. And as scientists, that's what some of our job is to do, to make sure those inputs are accurate.
Very good. We do have another question from the audience. It's kind of a two-parter. I'm not sure who it should go to. Maybe Brian, we'll start with you. They're asking if the inefficiency in nitrogen utilization is due to inevitable lysine catabolism. And the second part is why 20 to 30% of absorbed lysine is catabolized regardless of how much is fed. Do you want to take that one on?
Excellent question. Very challenging question. I think let me answer it like three different ways, not to answer the question per se. One, I think it'd be extremely interesting to see what is the range in this catabolism in, let's say, a modern pig versus, let's just say, a non-modern pig. So is there variation? And if we understand is there variation, maybe understand why. The other angle I'm very interested in is there a difference in this catabolism between species? Let's just say between swine and broilers. Again, it gives a estimate or a knowledge of what we might be able to attack relative to reduce that. I have not read up on that lately. And also, this is the type of research that is not a one and done. It really need to be well thought out. So if you say we can reduce it say we can reduce it from 30 to 20%, that can be a huge impact on what we need to feed the animal. So it can have a huge impact on nitrogen use or amino acid use efficiency. But don't forget, we have all the other 20 amino acids to look at too. So I think it's an excellent question. How to reduce inevitable catabolism of any or all amino acids in a growing animal, in a gestating animal, in a lactating animal. An excellent question.
Anyone else want to add anything to that? All right. They're all quiet, Brian.
Great job.
Very good. Well, this has been a great discussion. I appreciate you all jumping on to walk us through and to provide this insight. Dr. Jerry Shurson, Professor Animal Science at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Brian Kerr, Animal Scientist with USDA-ARS, and Dr. Edward Yang, Business Development Manager of Nutribins. We appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Likewise, we appreciate all of you that tuned in and all of you that posted questions. We know you have a busy schedule, so giving us a little bit of your day, we really appreciate that. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format on feedstuffs365.com, including the one that Jerry mentioned here that we had done with him and some other colleagues back in November. So you can go back and check that out too if you'd like. You can view them at any time and share them as well if you would like. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.